There you go.
Well, now we're on. Yeah, thank you, buddy.
Thanks.
You tell them.
Yeah.
Shelley's at home, so.
That's why I'm not an IT guy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shirley.
Shirley or Shelley?
But as we talked about already, even the Jews aren't sure when this book was written. Because the Talmud, what's the Talmud? Anybody know?
Sounds like that was the Jewish book.
It's a Jewish book, but what is it?
It's got Jewish writings in it.
No. What's the Talmud? Anybody know?
Commentary.
Yeah, it's a commentary. The Torah,
Oh.
right, is Matthew, Mark, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. That's called the Torah. The Talmud is the commentary on not only the Torah, but also Jewish traditions, oral traditions. And it's huge. And it wasn't put down into writing in the way it is today until 400 or 500 AD, if I remember my history correct. So it wasn't being written all along, although Moses was there. Moses wrote the books, the first 5. And then the Jews had, we've talked about this in some other ways, about how they had all these oral traditions. They had these 660, whatever it is, rules and laws that you had to go through or keep with in order to live the Torah correctly. Those are all oral traditions that after Rome destroyed Jerusalem, these Jews started thinking, maybe we should write this stuff down. Because it really wasn't written in an organized way until then, according to most of the experts. And so you don't get these oral traditions put down on paper until well after the Jews have had their lives. So in the Talmud, even the Jews don't argue about when it was written as far as this is the time. Some suggest it's pre-Egyptian captivity, as we've already talked about. It's the time of Abraham and those guys. Some attribute it to Moses. They think Moses wrote Job just like he wrote some of the other books in the Bible. Some attribute it to Solomon, and it came after the kingdom was set up, after the nation of Israel's in place. Some attribute to the post-Babylon Empire. In other words, after they were taken into captivity and went back home, they wrote this. And so there is no general agreement on when the book of Job got written. The setting, as has already been mentioned, is way back, probably during Abraham's days, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we'll talk about that, why that may be. Some people suggest it's early because there is no reference to the Egyptian stuff. There's no Exodus isn't mentioned. Well, Moses not written about. So it had to be written long before those things happened. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't.
Because Job sacrificed for his kids himself. He didn't go to a priest or anything.
Correct.
So that's another reason they think that he was living in the time before the captivity and all that stuff.
Certainly, again, the story is certainly set in that time frame. And that is one of the things they look at. Job's sacrificing himself. He's not going to some priest. He isn't going to some rabbi. He's doing his own sacrifice for his children. But we really do need to distinguish between the time of the story setting and the time of the writing. Because if we read this and think, well, you're right, the Exodus isn't mentioned, so it must have been before that, because that was such an important thing in the life of the Jews. How many of us still read books? Anybody? Who's read a story recently set in cowboy days that doesn't mention 9/11? Anybody?
Doesn't mention what?
9/11?
I'm great. Yeah, I'm reading
I mean,
a trilogy
think about
that's
it.
all about that, yeah.
If we're going to argue that because the Exodus isn't mentioned in the story, it must have been written before the Exodus, then every Zane Grey novel, had to have been written before some of the major events in American history because they're not mentioned. Think about that for a second. The story could have been written at any time and not mention the Exodus. Just like we read stories written today, set long before September 11th, but written after, but they don't mention September 11th, so they'd had to have been written before that happened, because certainly everybody would have put that in there. Well, no, you don't. You set it in the setting of the story. And so there really is a disagreement on when was a story written as opposed to what's the setting of the story, which clearly is sometime prior to the law of Moses being set up. And Job's not Jewish, right? He's not
Right.
apparently from the line of Abraham. So there's no way of knowing for sure when all that stuff happened. And how come my little clip there, it's going the wrong way? Come on, clicker. We have to go get John and say, what's going on here? Somebody's buzzing to us. All right, if I can make my clicker work, we'll move on with this thing. Let's do this again. There we go. So some of the things that go along with when is the setting of the story, which I do think is still important for us to think about. Job lived quite a while. You know, he didn't live 80 or 90 days or years. He lived quite a bit. Job 42, he lived 140 years after all this stuff happened. So he's, you know, potentially 170, 180, 200 years old. He's acting, and we touched on this, Rosalind mentioned, he's acting as a patriarch, not as a priest. He doesn't go to a priest to get all the sacrificing done. So probably the settings before Moses. One of the money that they talk about in Job 42 is called the kekatah. In some of your Bible translations, it'll say silver. It'll say pieces of silver, as opposed to this Hebrew word that it actually is, because nobody knows what this is. But that coin is mentioned in Genesis chapter 33 in the days of Jacob and Esau, talking about Jacob's wealth and Esau's wealth. It was worth so many of these keshetah things, whatever that is, and nobody has a clue what that's really worth. But using that word would seem to confirm that the setting of the story, at least, is way back then. Now, people also use that as an argument that it must have been written way back then. Because how would people in the day of Solomon have a clue that this was the coin choice, 1,500 years before Solomon shows up? What's the answer to that?
I don't know.
Pardon?
Right.
I don't know.
That's a good answer. But you do know. If you think about it, you can know. Have you read a story that talks about doubloons or, ancient coins that we don't have anymore today? Well, obviously somebody remembers what they were. So the fact, again, that just because they mentioned them in the story doesn't necessarily mean that they had to have been written way back then because they didn't use those coins anymore. But that doesn't mean somebody didn't know that used to be the way those things were done. Who knows? And again, we're not going to argue, we're not going to resolve the argument of when was it written. You can come up with your own conclusion. But the conservative conclusion is written during the time of Abraham and the patriarchs, and the setting is that as well. That's what the conservative scholars would probably say. Again, supporting the pre-Moses time frame, the way Job is described. Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. That's not the typical description of people in the days of the old law. Most people aren't defined this way. So again, just the description of Job would seem to go back to those days. One problem I have with if it was written long before Moses is God's name is used. Look at verse 6 of chapter 1. Or I've got it on the screen if you don't want to hunt it up.
Because that's Yahweh.
Yeah, it mentions Yahweh because the word Lord is there, right? We've learned it here enough to know that means Yahweh's name's in the book. How would they have possibly known Yahweh's name before Moses? Because doesn't God tell Moses what his name is, doesn't he? Yeah, he does that way back in Exodus 3 when Moses says, who should I say is sending me to the Pharaoh? God gives a pretty good description of I am, and that's my name, and that's what you call me. How would the people living before then have had any idea that was God's name? Legitimate question, I think. Now, one potential answer is God told somebody else. Just because we don't have anything in the Bible saying it until we get to Moses, doesn't mean God hasn't told some other people, potentially, that was his name, especially somebody like Job, who's upright, shuns evil, and sacrifices all this stuff. But I don't think so. My opinion is, this sort of flies in the face of it was written before Moses, because these people wouldn't have known what Yahweh's name was prior to Exodus chapter 3. So some suggest it's during the golden age of Jewish poetry. In other words, when David's writing his psalms, that we spent time, as Hoyt just said, he doesn't like this kind of poetry. But it's very similar to the Psalms, the Proverbs, the poetic books that we have, which is why it's labeled in there. It's put in the book. It's poetry book. It grapples certainly with some theological questions, some of which are grappled with in some of the Psalms, and we'll review some of those as we go through Job, how they sort of sound like David's Psalms or somebody else's Psalm. They're pretty similar kind of stuff. Notice too, it says in Job 1:1, he was from the land of Uz. Who's Uz? Of course, I've given you the answer already. He's Shem's grandson. And he, so again, trying to get the setting of way back there in the days of Moses and all the flood, and here's all these people, and he's named after one of those people potentially. But again, these are arguments one way or the other as you think about when was this thing written. And again, some suggest it was post-Babylonian exile, and there's some pretty good merit for that, because some of the words we find in the book of Job weren't in use until after the Babylonian exile. So how did somebody writing this book in 1750 BC know those words? Again, arguments both ways, that makes some sense. Truth is, nobody knows. So buy it whichever way you want it, come up with your own conclusion. It obviously, when it was written, is not as important as what was written. What's the message we're going to try to get out of this thing? Debbie's already raised the question. The theological issue primarily is, why do righteous people suffer? People today ask that same question. If there's really a God, if he's really all powerful, if he's really all good, why did he let this happen to me? Why do things like this go wrong? Why is the world in such turmoil? Why doesn't God fix all of this stuff? And those same people, if they read the book of Job, will argue, why is God letting Satan do these things? I mean, I don't know about you, but as I read the book of Job, the first couple of chapters, I wonder that. God, why did you let this angel of yours go do these things? Why didn't you just slap him down and tell him, leave my man alone? Because he's righteous and shuns evil and sacrifices and does all this stuff. But God doesn't do that. He lets Satan go do some pretty ugly stuff to Job and his family.
What a great example
Of?
Belief and
And
trust
Yeah.
and that
Perseverance.
And that's the message.
perseverance,
Yeah.
That even if bad stuff, he believed and he knew. And just what an example he must have been.
And the challenge for us is to be like Job.
Right.
That when life throws us a curveball,